let me build a school for you real quick, okay? And then tell me if you'd enroll your child. Kids in this school get out of the classroom more to explore new environments, work on experiential projects together. Teachers here learn the particulars of your child's developmental needs at that moment, spending extra time to build quality relationships. Delinquency and absence, lower than in other schools. Engagement is higher. Same for teacher expectations, higher. Oh, and it's only boys. Everything I just mentioned represents the best of all boys education in a 2025 report from the American Institute for Boys and Men, AIBM. They look at all this data from across the world, and they're trying to find out whether single-sex schools could benefit America's boys who are falling behind in education. Some of the data is, I'd say it's encouraging. Some lackluster. Other parts like building soft skills or looking at long-term effects, they're missing altogether in some cases. Ben Smith is the head of research at AIBM, and I asked him to come on to talk more about optimizing school environments for boys. Ben Smith, welcome to All Boy.
Hey there, thanks for having me.
Until this new report from AIBM, I had no idea. I knew there were all boys schools in America. I didn't know they could be public schools. How does that work?
So I think unlike racial segregation, which was deemed sort of inherently unequal in the 1950s, the status and the legal status of single-sex schools has been a little murkier and ambiguous. There have been a number of Supreme Court cases through the decades. One in the 90s had to do with Virginia Military Institute. It was a military academy for like a college level, and they tried to create a separate women's leadership institute, which the court disagreed with and said it wasn't kind of an adequate alternative, and so it's always been kind of contested, but not completely verboten. Kind of starting in 2001 with the No Child Left Behind Act, Congress approved some funding for single-sex schools. And in 2006, they adjusted Title IX to kind of allow the possibility for single-sex schools, and part of this was just, with a goal of, trying different things. I think a little bit of experimentation. They're still contested. Occasionally the ACLU or some other organization or a parent will kind of contest the presence or existence of single-sex schools, but in general, courts have kind of, at least since the 2000s, have upheld kind of the legitimacy of having them, with some stipulations and constraints around, whether it's voluntary. It has to be voluntary. You can't force someone to go to a single-sex school. There's got to be kind of a co-ed alternative, things like that. But that's kind of the rough legal landscape and policy development over the last several decades.
I see. So while it became legal and while some schools did pop up and got funding, it didn't exactly explode. The numbers here, I kind of scrolled down and I thought, well, I thought there'd be more because I would think there'd be more interest. So in 2016, there were 58 all-boys schools in America. 2022, 45. So it actually fell.
Fell a little bit. And to be clear, these are public schools. Obviously, the vast majority, or maybe not obviously, but they're like 700 all boys schools. Most of them are private, and so those are much more common in the private realm. But yeah, there was kind of, I don't know, the baseline was like 2 single-sex schools in the 90s, I think, and so there was kind of a flurry of activity and experimentation, and since probably the mid-2010s, a little bit of retrenchment, either because they're not seeing the results or kind of political or support has waned or something like that. But overall, you're right, just not very many at all.
And I don't know if you live in DC. I live in DC where the charter system is really popular. It's uber competitive. People try to get the best lottery number, get their child into the best charter school. We've done that with the charter system. And the attributes here are also that most of these are charters, right? They're mostly Black and Latino male students in low income areas, their charter schools?
Yeah, and some of this data is a little hard to piece together. There's no kind of central repository for everything, but yeah, in general, a lot of the students going to public, single-sex schools are minority, Black or Latino students. You see a lot of kind of experimentation, I think, with kind of like urban or low-income school districts, thinking that for Black boys in particular, maybe this is a helpful model that would kind of reverse or arrest some of the kind of the negative trends that you see in those communities sometimes, at least with respect to educational outcomes and things like that.
Which maybe we should note that is one of the pillars of focus at AIBM. You do intentionally try to take a look at certain communities who have had
I think we have this kind of cross-cutting interest in in particular Black boys and men. When you look, there are like concerning statistics for men overall, related to suicide and drug addiction and higher ed enrollment and things. But many of those trends are worse among minority men, and I think it's definitely plausible and probably right that there are different solutions depending on the context. Men may be enrolling at in higher ed institutions at a lower rate, but that doesn't mean there's like one solution that will fix that, because men, exist in a lot of different contexts and environments, and certain things are more salient or important. And so being sensitive to that, I think, is definitely one of our goals.
I got really excited when I saw you guys put out this report, because I have twin sons, 6 years old, always thinking about how can we get the best educational system for boys, especially boys who might be more hyperactive or ADHD, or just, boys, they develop more slowly.
And sorry, I don't want to intrude you.
And so, I wanted to acknowledge what you said, is that there's a whole range of boys who are there from all sorts of different backgrounds. I didn't come from any sort of all boy setting. And in fact, I probably tried to stay away from them because I liked all the little girls to play with. But you actually came from the Naval Academy and served in all male environments. Could you say something about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think, statistics can be a little bit dry. I was trying to think of, what's my own experience. Like you, I didn't go to any like single sex institutions. The Naval Academy, right, is majority men. It was about 80%, I think, at the time I went there. And then I was a submarine officer, which at the time, and still largely is, but at the time was exclusively male. And I don't know, as I've come here as a researcher and reflected on a little bit more, I do think that dynamic, there's something distinctive and useful about that environment, and you kind of have to. It's hard to separate the all male aspect from the military aspect from the job aspect, right? There's something, schools are different from jobs in the sense that in education you kind of have your own goals. It's very individualized in some sense, and I think what a lot of the power of like being in an all male work environment, at least, was that there's like tighter bonds, and you're definitely working toward a common purpose, and that's something you get very strongly in the military, especially, but I think in work environments oftentimes more generally. But I don't know. I think there's a different dynamic. The culture is a little bit different. Even when you introduce women, and they should have opportunities and be able to participate in different things. But I think it's true that it probably does change the climate a bit, and for better or worse. There's definitely probably positive aspects to it as well. But I don't know. I think it was a valuable experience for me, and I kind of cherish it, and I don't think a lot of men get that type of experience any longer.
Well, and you often hear all-girls schools, they say, we want to keep it this way, so it's not a bad thing to be an all-boys school. There are a lot of girls' schools saying, we don't want boys coming in here, whether it's distracting or just changing the dynamic, or we have our own traditions. And so those things can be really valuable, like you said.
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And I think Yeah, obviously, all girls schools exist, and there are some benefits to those, and there's obviously, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit. You know, there's a self-selection effect, and that's bad from a research and analysis perspective, in that it makes it hard to tell what are the actual effects of single-sex schooling. But it's also reflective, I think, of the fact that people have different preferences and thrive in different environments, and having the existence of an all-boys school or an all-girls school can be really helpful for the people, for a subset of people that enjoy or thrive in that environment. And you as a parent are going to have more insight into what is helpful for your individual child, and I think at least having the choice is valuable.
It's apt that you bring up self-selection, because when we discuss this, and I want to get into the hard evidence and the possible evidence or hopes that exist out there,
Yeah.
is that there are limitations right now. As you say, self-selection, we haven't done randomized controls or what have you, but there are also some maybe natural experiments you're drawing on here internationally and things like that. So let's start with the hard, because that's also for proponents probably the hardest pill to swallow.
Yeah.
It's not exactly robust in every way. And then things that you think would be helpful to establish, and glimmers out there that seem like, oh, well, that's actually promising. So starting on the hard evidence side right now,
Yeah.
what people say, how are outcomes? We're going to talk about character and motivation and engagement. But as far as literacy, math, do boys from all boys schools, public schools, do better?
Yeah, I think the evidence says that a little bit, but not much. It's really not a big effect. So first, there's a lot of analytical difficulties with understanding the impacts of single-sex schools. Like you mentioned, there's a self-selection. So boys that go to all-boys schools can be much different on numerous dimensions than an average student, right? They tend to be wealthier, or when you're talking about private all-boys schools and things like that. And so it can make it a little bit difficult. But there was a good sort of meta-analysis, and all that is just someone goes through the literature, finds all the different studies on single-sex schools, kind of ranks them or identifies how rigorous they are, and looks at a couple different things, but essentially tries to aggregate all the effects of these. And overall, the for all boys schools, there's small improvement in math and literacy, but these are really relatively small. And one way to think about it is like if you're at the 50th percentile in math or something, and you go to an all-boys school, maybe you're the 52nd percentile. These are pretty small things. They exist, but they're quite small. And and that's also including a lot of international studies, because internationally there's some better, there were some policy changes. There's some randomization effects that make analysis a little bit easier, and better able to isolate some of the causal effects. But within the U.S., the differences are not significant between boys going to all boys schools versus co-ed. And so that's kind of math, science, reading, literacy, these sort of academic outcomes that a lot of people care about.
And it is important. Yet, I can't help but think, when you meet a boy, when you date somebody, when you hire a man, you don't always think, okay, what's your literacy score or what's your math score? You also care about the person they've become. So again, we're going to get to that. But let me just acknowledge Nina Hankins at the Goldman School wrote a report, which you draw on, and we'll link here, and you guys link to, which is really valuable because it's 100+ pages that people can read through a lot of this information. But there is a 2014 study, and you say this, quote, Among the subset of US focused studies, the weighted effect sizes were close to zero and insignificant. These effect sizes suggest minimal academic impact of single sex education on boys' performance when proper controls are added. And also note that perhaps more effective, things like high dose tutoring or structured literacy and phonics programs if someone doesn't have access to one of these schools.
Yeah, I think, part of the way I think we illustrated it in the piece was, there's a huge range of educational interventions, things you could do to help improve learning outcomes, right? Some of them are quite costly, some of them are cheap, some of them are more effective, some of them are less effective. If I wouldn't say we should turn everything into single-sex education to improve math and reading outcomes, because that would be quite expensive, I think, and the effects would be relatively small. When you look at other types of intervention, if your kid is having trouble reading, and for boys, that's a much more common difficulty that they face. Things like high-dose tutoring, where you kind of have individualized or small group attention, working with a paraprofessional or a teacher, a couple times per week. That's going to be quite effective at kind of improving some of those skills, and that makes sense, right? It's like a very focused intervention on the thing that you're having trouble with. It's not this broad change in environment that you're hoping will have some positive effects.
Right. We're doing Bob books in my house right now. And I'll give them the little one, that's called Matt or Sam or whatever.
Right,
And to
yeah.
see them read on their own and feel that sense of mastery, it does set you up for future success, you have to believe, where you say, I can do it.
Yeah, I think, that was definitely, my own personal experience. I'm a big reader. It's interesting to watch my son. He's not a bad reader, but he actually doesn't seem to enjoy it too much. And so now it's this, it's not just the mechanical aspect of it, which he seems to be, doing fine with, but also finding the right kind of texts that interest him. Like, the early phonics books, right? They're not a thrill to read, right? They're not page turners, probably. So it's a hard problem, I think, especially for boys who have more issues with reading just developmentally, and also I think sometimes with the interest in reading itself and the texts.
I don't know. Dot had a cat is a big page turner in my house. I don't know. I don't know about you. One more limitation I wanted to ask you about,
Yeah.
because we're talking about public schools here, but even the charter system you talk about opt-in and self-selection. Parents who know about the charter system and then opt into it and compete in it and things like that, they're also maybe different than families who just go to whatever zoned in school is local. And so beyond what school you're assigned to, it's kind of like who even gets in the system in the first place.
Yeah, and this is part of the selection effect. Like, even if you have a charter school that is a lottery, right, where a bunch of people apply and they randomly choose who gets in. One, you can be kind of skeptical of the lottery assignment itself. Is it truly random? And I think in some cases they say it is, but it's not so random. And the second one is that the people who put their name in the hat are different on a lot of in a lot of ways than the people that do not. They tend to be I'll give the example from my school district. I don't live in DC. I live in the suburbs of Milwaukee. But we had a charter, like a STEM charter school. It was a lottery system, which is kind of equitable in one way, but a lot of people complained that tended to be wealthier, whiter students that ended up there. And part of this is the selection effect of just who applies to these types of programs, for sure.
Okay, so we did what is maybe the hard part for people who are proponents of single-sex education. Now let's get to the part we're a little bit unsure of, but it looks maybe promising. In your report, you talk about proponents, people, educators who are involved in the system. They say there are close, high-quality relationships where the staff really invest in the lives of these boys. Can you give us a little more color on that, what that might look like in real life?
Yeah, I'll kind so yeah, part of Nina Hankins, who did this nice report for us. Part of it is looking at the academic literature and seeing what's available, but part of it was also talking to practitioners, leaders of these schools, or teachers in these schools, things like that. And the things they emphasize are not the things that the researchers necessarily emphasize. It's less on academic outcomes and more about, like you said, being able to have high quality, close relationships with boys. A lot of this revolves around the traditions and rituals and culture of the school itself, right? You know, as a charter school, compared to a public school, there are fewer constraints on how you can shape the environment for students. In private schools, that's even more the case, I think. But they put a lot of effort into project-based learning, or giving kids sort of these sort of transformative experiences, or things that they hope will be transformative. Taking them outside, doing things outside, giving them more physical activity. All of those, they think have shown particularly beneficial for boys, and that it allows them to experiment a little bit more. They're a little more willing potentially to go out on a limb if they're not trying to impress girls. Is maybe one reason, and it gives them a little more opportunity to fail, and those are important experiences for them. So when you talk about examples, you know. One example I'll give, and I don't think this is mentioned in the report, but there was a pretty good ethnography of, in particular, urban, majority, minority, single-sex schools. So a sociologist at Tufts went and hung out with kids at these two kind of urban charter and public schools that were single-sex, and looked at the things that they tried to do to help these boys who are predominantly black. And so, they talk about talking circles, setting aside time each day, or at least once a week, for boys to talk about their frustrations or things that they're having difficulty with. They try to, insert competition into some of the school events and things like that. I think one of the schools in this book had a top gladiator or something. The student, I don't know I can't remember what the criteria for selection were, but a student had distinguished themselves in a particular way, and they got this recognition, right? So there's a lot of these kind of ritualistic aspects to it. They try to do peer or mentoring with students one-on-one on a regular basis. All of those things kind of are potentially very helpful.
What you're describing is something that's really well-rounded, to where they've got the academics,
Yeah.
they've got the competition, they can get outside, get that physical activity, because boys just baseline on average need that more. And then you said talking circles. And that's what grabs my attention, because, boys, they're a lot more likely to be pigpiling than they are talking about feelings. And it seems like these schools try to really intentionally create that opportunity so that they can express themselves in that way. And that
Yeah.
carries far beyond the classroom, I have to imagine.
Yeah, the interesting thing, when you look at, and this is not exclusively single-sex schools, but a lot of charter schools, a lot of private schools, when you look at them, there's a lot more emphasis on, what they might call like character development. And that, for various reasons, I think is less of an emphasis in public schools generally. And I think because public schools have more constraints, there's a lot of emphasis on academic outcomes and things like that. But I think the character development aspect is potentially kind of this very, very valuable dimension to like a single sex education, where boys are trained to be more virtuous, or to be honest and have integrity, and those things are valued in those schools, certainly.
As a researcher, and you're a dad too, How do you think about that? Because on one hand, I see how maybe No Child Left Behind went too far or
Mhm.
whatever. On the other hand, for instance, after COVID, and I would have on my show the heads of the two major teachers unions, and they would say, let's not focus so much on academics. Let's talk about social emotional learning now. And I would press them and say, is that because kids are not doing very well on academics that now you want to shift the focus to something that is more squishy and yeah, maybe is important, but you can't get dinged on? And they'd say, of course not. But I, how do you think about the character element to this? I feel it's important, yet it can't be everything.
Yeah, I think, yeah. So I'll talk about this is a little. This isn't quite character, but I think it's definitely related. You have academic outcomes or academic metrics, and you have what's called social emotional learning. That's a term that's popular. Economists will call it non-cognitive skills. These are things that aren't well predicted by like IQ and things like that, but tend to be these other people call them soft skills. But it's like social skills. Can you work well with others? Are you diligent? Are you kind of academically engaged? Do you think that you belong in this school and are capable of doing well? Some of these are like mindset attitudes. Some of it are organizational and disciplinary or discipline types of things. Do you have like good self-regulation? And it turns out that these things are incredibly important for success. There's kind of an increasingly large literature that looks at kind of the long-term returns, in the labor market, especially to people with good soft skills, and they're becoming increasingly valuable and increasingly important. And so I think developing those is important, and I think in a lot of ways boys can be worse at them for various reasons, right? Both, they're slower to develop these types of things. They also have different aptitudes on average and interests and things like that. But I do think those are important. Obviously, yeah, you don't want to pivot to those things because you can't improve the academic outcomes or those things look bad. But I think they are increasingly important, and I do think emphasizing them is valuable, especially thinking long term for people.
I totally agree with that. I was listening to Kara Swisher's podcast recently about your job and the future of AI, and some of the top economists who were on there were saying, what I would tell my kids to study in college is psychology, because understanding people is going to be more important than ever with AI coming into the picture. My husband is a labor economist, and he always says soft skills are the most important thing to teach. And you're right. A lot of boys, we naturally go toward, all right, something's not going my way, someone's not cooperating, get aggressive. And actually that just does not work in
Or
life or in
disengage
home.
entirely, right?
Hmm.
And just withdraw. And yeah, I think that's definitely true. And the unfortunate part is that I think we just have less insight and knowledge about how to improve those things. I think there's some. I'm not too adept on the literature for like the social emotional learning curriculums and things, but I think there are some, real positive effects of having kids go through some of that programming. But just in terms of like, how do you create an environment where kids want to persevere and engage and try hard? And obviously individuals are going to vary in their kind of natural propensity to stay like focused and locked on, but there are things in the environment that you can potentially manipulate to make the environment one where focus is kind of a natural outcome or something like that. And I think any school can do that. There's potentially some benefits to being able to focus on one sex versus another in a single sex school, but I think those are important areas for future research, definitely.
And internationally, there have been certain studies which may give us some insights. Trinidad and Tobago found in all boys schools lower delinquency. South Korea found that absences were down, homework effort was up, and boys also felt their teachers had higher expectations of them in all boys schools than in mixed sex schools. I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, I think this is kind of the, when you look at the academic literature, this is sort of the promising, suggestive, benefits to single-sex schooling. There's been a lot, like we said, a lot of research on the academic outcomes, not huge impacts, but maybe there's something to these sort of behavioral outcomes that are worth understanding more, and you can look at the outcomes. In general, it's hard to measure things like perseverance and like academic engagement. These are sort of squishy, not super well defined concepts. But you can look at things like, are they more likely to graduate? And that's a good outcome that requires fortitude, persistence, things like that. And there are I think, some small positive benefits that are worth doing more research and understanding better.
When I heard the description of these schools, the first thing it reminded me of is the Scouts, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, where you have traditions in the schools and chants, and there's a big focus on belonging. And if we could, and then you talk about adventure and failure and then mastery, that a lot of these elements can be crucial for keeping boys like engaged in school. I was going to say hooked on school, but that probably has a bad connotation. Engaged in school.
I think those are important elements. One thing what your question made me think of was that boys, I think, sometimes don't necessarily see the utility or the purpose of a lot of things they're doing in school. And the more you can kind of make that connection explicit for them, like this is what we're doing and this is the value that it has. I think the more engaged they will often be, and that things like giving them, like you said, chances to fail, taking them outside, having some kind of objective task that they're trying to accomplish. I think that can be potentially very powerful.
The easiest day of the week in my house, Ben, because I do mornings with the boys and get them to school, is when you have robotics or PE. Those days, we don't fight. We're in the car. They're buckling themselves right in. Like those days are magic.
I asked my kid what he liked about school, and he's like, "Oh, PE." And you mentioned the robotics thing. That was this other element. We kind of mentioned the project-based learning. It's combining all these kind of academic skills, definitely, but towards sort of a tangible end, and I think that's valuable.
If people are listening and thinking, okay, I wonder if one of these schools are in my community, or I'd like there to be, maybe we could work on that. I wanted to mention the data that exists on who might thrive, because you mentioned there's a whole range of boys who might do well in different environments. There's this Witt and Holtz 2015 study that is in here, DeWitt. Boys who are 13 years old or older might do better than younger boys. The boys who are younger and are with girls might engage more. Could you say anything about that?
Yeah, you made me look at this a little bit closer, and I don't know. I wouldn't put a lot of weight on that particular study. Looking at it a little more closely, this was like an experimental study, which is good from one perspective, but it was like separating boys and girls and giving them like an hour of instruction, and then looking at some of the effects. And like, it's good from a randomization perspective, bad from how much can we generalize from this. I think it's definitely intuitively plausible to me that at certain ages, being in a single sex environment could be more or less valuable. But like, looking at you mentioned the 2014 meta-analyses, they looked at this a little bit. It's kind of mixed. Like, boys showed a small advantage in single-sex schools at like an elementary level, but co-ed schools seem better at a middle school level. But these are kind of like small numbers of studies, and it's hard to draw, I think, a strong conclusion about that. But I think anecdotally we can obviously think of reasons why it would be better for boys in high school to be sex segregated potentially than in elementary school. But research-wise, there's not a ton of evidence there.
See, that made sense to me when I saw it, though. I didn't know how limited it was.
Yeah,
but
no,
because my sons, I think they learned so much from the little girls in their class of how to work together, listen.
Yes,
And
yes.
in high school, it's a whole different dynamic,
And
yeah, where
this
you're trying to maybe
and this
impress them.
reminds me, like, there's kind of a separate stream of research that looks at classrooms and the effects of having more girls in a classroom. And it actually, boys do better in math when they're in classrooms with more girls in them. And these are like younger kids, like elementary age. And I see that with my son too. Like his second grade class has fewer boys in it than his first grade class did. He seems much better behaved, right? There's boys can like spin each other up, or they get distracted more easily, things like that. And so there's this effect, potentially positive, that girls have, and just creating a more orderly environment where everyone can succeed and do better on. So I think, yeah, I think that's a real thing, and an important aspect to consider when you're thinking about single sex schools.
You mentioned generalizability. Again, a lot of the American schools, they're majority minority, Black and Latino male students, largely low income neighborhoods and charter systems. Is there is that generalizable to a non-charter public system in, let's say, the suburbs or rural areas?
Well, one, I don't even, there's not a ton of good research to even generalize from. Like, most of them are majority minority, or many of them. But even then, within the US context, there's not a lot of good research on the effects of these
Which
single
is
sex
kind of
schools.
crazy, by the way. I could not believe how scant the research is.
Yeah, and I that's kind of one of our calls is like, one, personally, like, is there something I'm missing here? Like, why hasn't anyone done this? And we'd like to know. Maybe somebody has been doing something there. But that, yeah, there's just a lack of U.S. based research, because I think when we talk about generalizability, U.S. versus Trinidad and Tobago, or U.S. versus South Korea, those are potentially much different. I don't know a ton about the South Korean educational context, but I can imagine there
Really high
are
pressure.
real differences, right? That it's hard to generalize from. And I think for, when we're talking about some of these low income or majority minority districts, yeah, there would be some issues translating any results you see to like a suburban or a rural context. And you get a little bit of this in that ethnography I mentioned. It was definitely about trying to draw a distinction between these boys in this low income but single sex school compared to the rest of the neighborhood. There was a lot of violence, disorder, gang activity that isn't going to exist to the same extent, in other areas, and understanding that and translating it, I think, could be hard for sure.
Real quick, because I know I'm pressing your time, male teachers, I know that your organization, AIBM, has underscored time and again, we need more male teachers, that maybe you can't transform an entire school into all boys, but maybe you could bring some more men into classrooms.
Yeah, I think there's some decent evidence on the potential value of male teachers. I think Richard mentioned this in his conversation with you not too long ago. There was never a huge amount of male teachers. It's always been predominantly female, but that has even gotten more predominantly female over the last several decades, especially at the secondary school level. And so having more male teachers is potentially valuable. And there's some decent evidence about the presence of a male teacher potentially reducing some of the reading gaps between boys and girls, and improving academic outcomes in when you introduce more male teachers. It's especially evident, I think, and I think the evidence is a little bit better, especially for black boys. So having a black male teacher can increase the likelihood that they graduate on time, and things like that. And so that's potentially one mechanism where, hey, we can't make maybe we don't want to turn everything into a single sex school, but putting more male teachers in classrooms opens up the possibility for better relationships with boys potentially. They certainly see what academic success looks like in some sense. It's interesting to me, like when I talk to male teachers, often what they'll say is, yeah, I had a great social studies teacher that was a guy, and he made me be able to, he gave me this idea that, yeah, maybe teaching could be a worthwhile pursuit, and eventually they become teachers themselves. The other aspect of that, and I think you also discussed this a little bit with Richard, was just male teachers are more likely to be coaches. And a lot of the relationships, the especially deep relationships between boys and teachers, comes through like sporting contexts and things like that. And having more men doing that type of coaching and developing those relationships could be really valuable.
We talked about the knowns. We talked about the unknowns. Ben, net. I mean, you can speak as a researcher or as a dad.
Yeah.
Given the opportunity for an all-boys school and you have, let's say, a middle school, high schooler, good idea?
Yeah. So this is the important distinction to hold in mind is like from a policy perspective, right? What should we do? And I would say there's not, strong, I don't think we should make schools, exclusively sex segregated, or that we should open 1,000 more single-sex schools, or put a lot of like federal funding behind them, because the benefits where we've studied them aren't huge, and there's a lot more research I think that we should do. But from an individual perspective, right? I think I would be totally open to sending my son to an all-boys school, and I can think of some benefits, and I can reflect on my own experiences that we kind of discussed a little bit. But again, it's having unique insight into his individual, situation, and knowing whether that you think that could potentially be beneficial for them. So I definitely think there should be the opportunity to send kids and have them learn in that type of environment. And I think for a certain subset of kids, it can be really valuable.
Yeah, totally individualized. The option is nice, of course. Some days we might need one of your drill sergeants from the Naval Academy in our school with my boys, but just occasionally. All right.
That's how I feel.
I hope people read this study. Really, really valuable. Ben Smith, thank you.
Thanks so much. It was great talking to you.
There is some promise here when it comes to single-sex education. Of course, a lot more room for research too as well. We would love to see more research being done. But given everything Ben just shared, given the school I built you at the top of the show, would you choose an all-boy school for your son? I think I'd be open to it for sure if it were available in my community. Probably not elementary, but middle and high school. I see the value. What do you think? Also, subscribe to All Boy for free. On Substack, I wanted to let you know, I send out newsletters every week. If you want to know what's going on in my brain, in my house, beware, but it's coming out every week if you want it. Also, subscribe on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. The website's allboyallgood.com. I'm Chance Seals. See you soon.